lifting and moving. We're going to look at how to protect yourself by using proper body mechanics. Yeah, I know you've heard them say that you bend with your knees, don't lift like this, you don't hurt yourself. And it goes across anything that you're lifting, not just patients. We're going to look at how to manage moves in an emergency setting, in an urgent setting, or a non-emergency move, because sometimes you may need to very quickly remove a patient from a setting for his safety as well as yours. Other times you've got lots of time to spend with a patient, and they're stable enough that you can manage them more slowly before you move them. So those are mainly the things we're going to be looking at tonight. Before you lift, make sure you have a good idea of the weight that you're going to be lifting. If you have any question about it, you might ask your patient how much they weigh. You got to factor in the weight of the other equipment that you're going to have also. So you want to know how much your patient weighs. Remember we talked about this the other night as part of your essential functions. You have to be able to lift how much? 125 pounds. So between you and your partner, that's 250. If your patient weighs more than 250 pounds, what are you going to have to do about that? Get some help. Yeah, you're going to get some assistance to lift. Know what your own limitations are. Sometimes, I've seen many times where they'll put two very small, lightweight women on a truck and they're expected to lift this, big old person. So know what your limitations are. So make sure you position yourself at the right place. Make sure you plan and communicate with your partner. If you start lifting before they lift, what's going to happen to the patient? They're in the floor somewhere. So make sure you communicate. And the way you're going to do that is going to be by making eye contact with your partner. That way you're watching them and you know when you're going to do this. I have to tell you, many years ago when I was working in Pensacola, down there we wore white shirts. Who thought of white shirts for people in pre-hospital? I don't know. But we picked up this guy. He was a homeless guy, lived out behind this service station, and he was quite ill, so somebody called 911. So we put him on the stretcher, and my partner, who's a female, was at the head, and I was at the feet. Well, this guy we put on the stretcher was quite long. He probably was 6 foot something, and he had these feet that were about like this, and you can just guess where those shoes had been. Don't even know. So we put him on there, and his feet were kind of hanging off, and we hadn't covered him up, which now I know we should have. And we went to lift, and I'm looking at her, and all of a sudden she lifts, and I'm not ready. I'm the one that has to pull the hickey-doo to release it. And she starts lifting, and he slides down, and I get these big old boot prints with, I think it was dog feces, right here across my chest, because he slid down just like this. So I learned a very valuable lesson very early about making sure you make eye contact. And once you count that off, 1, 2, 3, we're going to lift. So you can avoid that. That was quite smelly for me. I had to go back to the station and change clothes. Couldn't stand that. So make sure that you're both on the same page, no matter if you're lifting on the ends or what you're doing. When you're working as a team, you need to make sure that you're all on the same page. Rules for lifting. Make sure that your feet are properly positioned. I know all you guys read that chapter, right? Remember this part? How far should your feet be positioned? Shoulder width apart. If your shoulders are this wide, then you're going to give it this number, right? If you're really skinny, maybe like this. But that's going to give you your best balance. It's not out like this. It's going to be just pretty much shoulder width apart. You want to use your legs when you're lifting. They're much stronger than your arms are. And the thing about using your arms, it's going to do a lot of pulling on your back. And so you want to avoid that. Don't lift and turn and twist. When you're lifting something heavy and then you go to turn, you're really altering the way your spinal column is designed to help you handle the weight. So never lift and twist. You can twist sometimes and you can turn sometimes, but don't have weight on that when you do it. Do not compensate when lifting with one hand. Don't ever try to lift a stretcher with just one hand. Don't get it in the middle of here. You won't be lifting these stretchers for a while, I'm afraid, because you've got to have that balance. Keep your weight as close to your body as possible, so you don't want to extend out like this. Now, when you move in a stretcher, that's not usually a problem, but the times that you're usually extending is when you're moving a patient, say, from your stretcher to the hospital bed, or you're trying to get them out of the bed and onto your stretcher. So you may find yourself leaning over and trying to lift. So always try to be as close to that weight as possible. If it means you kind of scoot yourself up on the bed so you can lift the patient and pull them towards you as you come back. It's going to be a lot safer than, trying to reach over and pull them this way. Whenever possible, use the stair chair when you're carrying a patient on the stairs. Now, we will be looking at those in the lab next week when we go down on Wednesday. Stair chairs are designed for you to put a patient who's conscious, who doesn't have a respiratory problem, a patient that's able to sit up on their own. You can strap them into a chair, got little wheels on the bottom, and you can kind of very easily, much more easily take them down the stairs than if you try to put them on your stretcher and take your stretcher and the patient down the stairs. This is an example of the power lift. Now, when you grab something to lift it, if I'm trying to lift his arm and I grab it like this, what's going to happen? Show me how quickly you can pull your arm from my hand. That's going to be your weakest area. So if I grab him under here and he pulls it down, it's going to be much more challenging. So that's the power grip. So you're going to grab from underneath like this. So you're going to have a much better handle on that stretcher, the power grip, and the power lift. When you look at the power lift, he's just using his quads, he's using his thighs here as he's lifting up like that. Just tweaking it. All right. When you're reaching, try to keep your back locked in position. I'm not really sure what exactly that means. Keep it locked in. But you want to keep it as straight as possible and use your knees more than leaning over like this. But this position is even worse. Avoid twisting while you're reaching. Avoid reaching more than about 15 to 20 inches. If it's that far away, you need to move yourself so that you can better reach it. But if you're reaching very far and then you lift the weight, you're going to tear your back up. Pushing or pulling. The experts say to push, don't pull. I don't know, I always like to pull. It seems to do much better for me. Pushing is kind of hard sometimes when you have a patient there. Line of pull to the center of the body. Just try to keep your back straight so that you're pulling towards yourself. Try to keep, if the weight is below you, like it's low, say, our stretchers can go to several heights. The normal height is going to be full height, but you can drop them at just about any level. You can drop them all the way down to the floor, and sometimes you may have to do that to get a patient onto it. But when you go to lift that, you need to either go down on one knee or both knees so that you can lift yourself up and your patient. Now we're going to move into some kind of interesting things. The different types of moves: emergency move, an urgent move, and non-urgent moves. And students confuse those a lot because they're a little bit confusing, I think. Let's see what we can find. Emergency moves. We will do an emergency move when there is an immediate threat to your patient. Usually we're going to see that on a hazardous scene where it's unsafe. If you have to reposition a patient so you can get to another patient, for example, say you've got an MVC and the driver of the car is here and they're alert and oriented and they're stable enough that you could take some time with them, but the passenger who you can't reach any other way can't be gotten to unless you move the first guy. So you would have to move the first guy to get the second guy if they were real critical or unstable. So that would be an emergency move. Now there are different ways that are available to you to move a patient in the event you had to move them emergently. Ordinarily you wouldn't do these types of things, but if you're in a building and all of a sudden, it breaks out in flames and you need to get your unconscious patient out, you can do a clothes drag where you're actually just grabbing them by the clothing behind their head, and you should cradle their head in your arms and then just kind of drag them off with you. The head first drag. Now this it's possible you may have to move the patient, say, down some steps this way, or in an area where you can't get a stretcher and you just come up under the patient, cross their arms, and you grab them like this, and then you walk backwards with the patient. The firefighter's drag, I'm telling you, I think I could find another way to drag my patient than this. He's got the hands tied around his head. Well, the key here is if you're in a fire, you want to be as low as possible because heat rises and your coolest, freshest air is going to be at the bottom. So maybe that's why they put this one here. I've never known anybody do this. But in case you see this on a test on National Registry, this is the firefighter's drag. The firefighters carry, you've all seen that, you carry little kids that way. Done that quite a few times. One rescuer assist, if the patient doesn't have a spinal injury, they are conscious enough that they're able to walk on their own, but you need to get them out of a site for safety reasons, then you can just put one arm around the neck and walk them off. This would be only as an emergency move. You need to get them out of that site quickly. You don't have time to get the stretcher, get them all tied in. It's almost like a snatch and go. Two rescuer, if the patient's not able to walk well on their own, it may take two of you to do that. Those people look so happy there, don't they? Urgent moves. Required treatment can be performed only if the patient is moved. For instance, you have a patient that's sitting up in the car and he's bleeding profusely, but you can't really get to him. You may have to move him urgently so that you can render care. If the patient starts deteriorating on you, he was fine and now he's getting worse, I got to get him out fairly quickly, that would be an urgent move. In this event, you may have to move a patient that has a potential spinal injury, but you're not going to all the time of restraining them in a short spinal immobilization device, which we'll talk about later. You may just have to turn them and take them out quickly. We'll learn those in the lab too. Now sometimes you may move a patient urgently to a long spine board. This is where you're going to be careful, but it's still going to move much more quickly than if you took the time to put them in a short spinal immobilization device. We'll look at those in the lab also. Now sometimes we do a rapid extrication. This would be a patient that's unstable. They're possible that they're critical, and you need to go ahead and get them out of the vehicle fairly quickly. So we're going to look at how to do a rapid extrication in the lab. We may not do that this week, but we'll be doing it pretty quickly. Non-urgent moves, this is a patient that's stable. You check their vital signs, they're okay, they're not fixing to die. They don't have a compromise of their ABCs. A is what? Airway, breathing, circulation. Circulation means either they're bleeding profusely somewhere or they have real low blood pressure or something of that sort. So if they have a compromise to ABC, we're going to want to move them quickly. But if they're stable enough, they don't have that kind of compromise, then we may take more time to stabilize them before we take them out of the vehicle. So there will be no immediate life threat. You can assess them where they are, usually get their vital signs, start on oxygen, whatever it is you need to do before you take them out of the ambulance. And then we'll take extreme precaution to protect their spinal cord and put them in a short spinal immobilization device and then move them to a long spine board. So that's going to be a non-urgent move. So that's kind of self-explanatory. Okay, let's look at the different devices that you're going to have. And I know you've seen the pictures in the book. In the lab on Wednesday, we'll pull these things out and look at them. But they all have, they're designed for different types of circumstances. This is a wheel ambulance stretcher or stretcher. This is the one you're going to interact with most commonly. This is what you're going to use on probably 90% of your patients. And most of them these days are hydraulic, so you can just kind of release it. And I say most, I take it back. Around here, probably not so much, but maybe half of them where it's hydraulic. So if you have a choice, work for a service that has a hydraulic. Save your back. So we'll look at this on Wednesday. This is an example of a bariatric stretcher. Some of the larger services in the big, larger cities are investing in one or two of these devices, and they'll have it available during the day if they have a call for a patient who is extremely overweight. That guy doesn't look all that big. And this has a little walking thing up, and they'll walk them up there. So the stretcher actually carries much more weight than the normal stretcher that we have in the back of our ambulance. They're called bariatric stretchers. They're designed, some of them are designed up to carry 700 pounds. That's a lot. This is a picture of an example of a stair chair. There's all different ones. They have some really sharp ones that are like motorized, and they practically walk up the steps like little robots. They're kind of handy. Now this one is probably nicer than the one we have in the lab. The one we have is kind of a lower model, an older model, but they all work essentially the same way. Help you move a patient up and down stairs if they're able to sit up. This is a short spine board. Some services may carry these. I have only seen these very infrequently. And you would use this for a child, or you could use this on a patient, say that they're sitting up in a car wreck, and you can slide it behind them, and you can immobilize them basically from the hips up, but it doesn't immobilize their legs. But this will secure them until you can pull them out of the vehicle and then put them on a long spine board. This is a KED, Kendrick's extrication device, and this is the one we're going to be using in the labs as far as a short board type of device. It has these long little slats down the back that don't bend. So this is where the patient's head goes. These kind of wrap around the patient, and it allows you to maintain the stability of their spine while you're taking them out of the vehicle. And sometimes you may use these. I've used these on children before. It makes it very easy for you to immobilize them. This is called a scoop stretcher. We have a couple in the lab, and they're metal. I've ordered a couple like this, and they're really handy. What's nice about these is these breaks away here. You can separate this into two pieces. So if you had a patient that was in an odd position, you can slide one side up under them, then they come around and slide the other side up under them. You can move them out, and then if you don't need to keep them on the board, you can just unhook it and take the parts out without having to toss them off to pull your board out. So they're quite handy. Now they're not really appropriate for somebody with a spinal injury because there's no support through here. This is a basket stretcher. When do you think we'll use a basket stretcher? When you're having to lower them down through what?
Uneven grade.
Yes, if it's uneven. This way it makes it very easy for several rescuers. You probably use 4 people, maybe even 6, to carry this basket. This is the kind they used, I know, in Hurricane Katrina when they drop that down to collect patients and then bring them up that way. Certainly uneven terrain out in the mountains. You got somebody that's fallen down in a crevice. They'll drop somebody down, put them in this basket and pull them out. Works real well. Now flexible stretcher. This is also called a Reeves sleeve, R-E-E-V-E-S sleeve. And it, like that KED, has slats that run lengthwise, but nothing that runs crosswise. So you can actually roll a patient in there. It's not that wide, so you can roll them up, but you're able to bring the sides up around them. So when would this be convenient? When would you use that? When would you use this, you think? Having it flexible so that it can roll up around the patient, making, say, a patient that was a stretcher, say, your regular stretcher is this wide, and now you can just roll the patient up like this and make it very narrow. When would that be useful? Yeah, tight spaces. Yeah, you're going down a hallway. You know, I saw a hallway one time where this lady could pile books. She was a reader, which I'm a reader, so I understand that. But had just stacked books all the way down her hallway, so that to go down the hallway, I mean, you almost had to go sideways to get down there. There was no way we were going to get her out. We couldn't even get the stair chair in there. So we had to put her in a Reeves sleeve, curl up the edges, you know, one of us at one end, one at the other, and we just kind of, you know, scooted through there. So it's kind of tight. So a Reeves sleeve is very handy. Yeah, that's almost it about that. A bariatric tarp. Now this one doesn't look as large as many others, the ones I've been used to. Sometimes they'll come with like up to 8 of these handles, and it's, you know, much larger. There may be times you will have to put a patient on this to get them out of the house so you can get them on your stretcher. So they're heavy duty. A vacuum mattress. Now I've never actually used one of these, and they're not real common because they're very expensive. And you put a patient on here and you suck the air out of it, and it's a vacuum thing, and it closes in around the patient. So you take them to the ER, usually they're not going to take them off of this device right away. And since it's so expensive, you worry about not getting it back. So you don't see it very commonly, and that's one of the reasons. How do you choose the appropriate patient carrying device? What are the things you're going to think about? The terrain. Yeah, how much space I've got. Can I get my stuff in there or not? What else are you going to think about? Yeah, what kind of injury, meaning?
Spinal cord.
Yeah, they have a spinal cord injury. What about if they can't breathe and have a respiratory problem? Yeah, they're going to want to sit up. If you can't breathe, the last thing you're going to want to do is lay down. So you got to think about a lot of different things. Do you need spinal mobilization? What's the space like? What does the patient weigh? What's the terrain like that you're going to be carrying them over? Now, if you have a patient that you suspect has a spinal injury, and there will be times where you can be fairly certain there's a spinal injury based on the assessment of the patient. But other times you can have a patient with a spinal injury and they're not showing any signs of symptoms. So you want to make sure you you err on the side of caution here. So even though they don't show any signs and symptoms of a spinal injury, you're going to look at something called mechanism of injury. And this is a phrase you need to know. Let's spell that right. Can't see it close. Can't spell it. Mechanism of injury. So you're going to look at the amount of energy that's been exchanged in that accident. If the patient fell from the 3rd floor window down on the cement, do you think that you would suspect they had a serious injury there? Yeah. If they got up and walked away from that and just kind of shook it off, what would you be thinking? Whoa, Superman, how did you do that? So yeah, you're looking at the mechanism of injury, the injury by which, or the force by which they were injured. So even if they don't show any signs or symptoms, you want to suspect that they've had a serious injury. The other phrase I'm going to throw in here right now is this one. I can't even spell right now. Suspicion. That's not right. Do we have a speller in here? Suspicion. T-I-O-N. Yeah, I have to look at it. P-E-C. What?
T-I-O-N.
S-U-S-P-I-C-I-O-N.
P-I. All right, good. Does that look better? If I get back on it. Yeah, it looks right. Okay, index of suspicion. So based on the mechanism of injury, meaning what happened, I will maintain a high index of suspicion that the patient has been seriously injured. What are y'all doing? Spell check? I got that worked out. Got my man in the back. Got that worked out. Okay, so if your patient fell from the 3rd floor balcony, the mechanism of injury would be a fall from a height, and I would keep a high index of suspicion that they would have a serious injury. Does that make sense? That's how those phrases are used. So, if there's been a significant energy transfer, you have a serious mechanism of injury. They were in a car that was traveling 50 miles an hour when it hit another car traveling the opposite direction at 50 miles an hour. You have a huge exchange of energy there, right? So you have a serious mechanism of injury. So you would have a high index of suspicion that they would be hurt. So you want to look at the mechanism of injury to determine if you think that there's a good chance that they've had a spinal injury. Whether they act like or report pain, tenderness, or anything of that sort, it doesn't really matter. You will manage them based on mechanism of injury. Now, some patients, there's no way they've injured their spine, or it's highly unlikely they have. In that case, then you may move them in other ways. Like here it talks about the extremity lift. You may there may be times when you have to actually pick a patient up to move them, to put them on the stretcher, and this is the way, I've done something like that before, but you can think of those ways. These are also indicated for patients that do not have a suspected spinal injury. If they're on the ground, it's usually going to take a couple of you to get the patient up. Never seen anybody do this, but the draw sheet method, if you have to move a patient, we use this every day, daily in EMS, where you have to move a patient either from their bed to your stretcher or from your stretcher to the bed at the emergency department. And the best way to do this, always going to be generally, is to take the sheet, whatever they're laying on. If it's their sheet at their bed at their home, it's just ask them, say, do you mind if we take the sheet, we'll give it back to you at the emergency department. And then make sure they get it back. I hate to break upset, you know. So you just want to squinch it down, pull them off onto your stretcher, and then you can go ahead and cover them up after that. But it saves moving the patient a lot. And sometimes moving them can be very uncomfortable for them. If you've got a patient, you know, with a broken hip or some other musculoskeletal injury, and they're in bed, that sheet works just great. And then of course when you're moving them from your stretcher to the hospital bed, you know, somebody's going to get on the other side of the hospital bed, you just can pull the sheet right to you. So if you can manage that, it works really well. Now this position, this is a patient positioning, and this is called the recovery position or shock position. And anytime you have a patient that is either conscious or unconscious, but that is stable in that they are breathing okay, their ABCs are okay, the thing we're worried about here with the patient is that they may vomit. And if they're laying flat on their back and they start to vomit, can that be a problem? Yeah. So recovery position allows them to maintain and control their own airway, and if they vomit, it'll go, gravity will take it down. You'll still need to do some airway clearing, but you greatly reduce the risk that they're going to choke to death. So this is recovery position, also known as shock position. Now, if you put a patient in this position, one thing you're not going to want to do is put anything in the mouth. Now, he may have oxygen on him, and that's okay. You'll have to monitor them closely. But when we get down to the lab, we're going to talk about airway adjuncts, the things we're going to put in the mouth to help hold the tongue away. You don't want to put that on the patient that's laying on the side. If they start to vomit, they could easily choke on that because basically it kind of interferes with that airway a little bit. Now this is, we call this position of, well, this is not the position of comfort. This is called Fowler's position. Fowler's position, and there's semi-Fowler's position. Fowler's basically means that they're sitting up. So if they're sitting up real high, it's Fowler's position. If you put them down at about 45 or so, it's semi-Fowler's. When we say position of comfort, if I said, ask you to put a patient in their position of comfort, that would be the position that they are most comfortable in. For example, if you have a patient, say, with a severe abdominal pain, how do you think he's going to be most comfortable? You ever had severe abdominal pain? Kidney stones, gallstones, any of that kind of stuff, appendicitis? Yeah, they kind of want to reduce any tension on the abdomen, so they're going to want their knees up. They may want to lay on their side, kind of in the fetal position. That's their position of comfort. A woman with severe respiratory distress, her position of comfort is going to be sitting up as high as she can get. We'll talk about the reason for that later. So you want to know what the position of comfort is for your patient, and as long as it won't harm them, you want to put them in their position of comfort. Positioning for shock. We're going to talk at length probably next week about shock. Shock is a situation where your patient is not getting enough blood flow, oxygen flow, to all the organ systems. So if they're in shock, usually their blood pressure is really low, their oxygen level is really low, and they're not perfusing. And that's a word you'll need to know. We'll go over it and over and over it. perfusing, that means the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the cells, and then the removal of waste products and carbon dioxide. So, in order to help the perfusion of your patient, you want to put them in, say, a shock position. So they're usually going to do better for perfusion purposes if they are more of a supine. Remember we talked about supine and prone the other day? Supine is what? On your stomach? Yeah, it's on your back. So you may place them on their back. You don't put their head down and you don't really raise their legs up. It's pretty much flat. That reduces the workload on the heart, reduces oxygen consumption. Transferring the patient to a hospital stretcher, we talked about this. The sheet pull is going to be the easiest way to do this, where you just slide them over. Make sure if the patient's unconscious that you don't let their head bang around. And make sure when you lift and move a patient that you work together, that you're communicating well with your partner. You're very careful of your own personal body mechanics so you don't get hurt. It's very easy to injure yourself while you're trying to move around patients. And you certainly don't want to do anything that's going to injure your patient, you know, like tip them over off the stretcher. Ooh, sorry about that, Mr. Bill. Emergency moves may aggravate spinal injuries. So make sure that if you do an emergency move of a patient, that they absolutely require an emergency move. If you've got a patient with a suspected spinal injury, you snatch them out of that car, you know, get them on your stretcher, and they turn out to have a serious spinal injury, and you didn't do what you should have done. Remember we talked about negligence yesterday? Yeah, they can sue you for negligence if you've caused more harm to them. Years ago, I was working at a swimming pool out in California, and the swim coach was coaching these kids, and this little 10-year-old girl dove into the pool, shallow end, because they do that, and she evidently hit her head, and she came up, she told the coach, I hit my head. And so he says, well, swim over here, you know. So he's going to lift her out of the pool, and so he picks her up like this. Before she got out, he says, you know, do your arms or legs tingle or anything? Do you have any pain anywhere? She says, no, just where I hit my head. So he lifts her up, and I watched him sit her down on the edge of the pool, and he plopped her down like a sack of potatoes, boom, like that. Well, what wasn't a spinal injury is a spinal injury now. She had a non-displaced fracture. She had fractured a couple of vertebrae in here, and they were just kind of sitting. And when he gave her this number, now she got a compression fracture. So it's up to you to be very careful and recognize that just because they're not symptomatic now, that doesn't mean they don't have a non-displaced fracture. As long as it stays in place, we're okay. But as soon as it starts moving, if it's fractured, it will move eventually. Patient's going to have a problem. So you've got to keep that in your mind all the time, so you don't make things worse. Urgent moves are used when the patient must be moved quickly, but there is a little time to take some temporary spinal precautions. You know, the first ones where we did like that closed drag, if you've got a patient there, flames all around, it's like, we got to get out, it's called the snatch and run. That's an emergency move. Whereas an urgent move is going to be, well, I think we have time that we can at least hold the head like this, or we can put a cervical collar on, and then we can try to carefully take them out of the vehicle, or something like that. And then the non-urgent move would be when you take the time to put that KED or the short spine board on them, then move them out. So that would be a non-urgent move. Make sure that you just protect yourself and use good body mechanics. I think I have a video I'm going to post for you about good body mechanics, so watch for that on the website. Make sure you select the right patient carrying device for whatever your situation is. I've seen crews before trying to carry Granny down the staircase with a stretcher. You know, you can pull the wheels all the way up and you can carry it, but that daggum stretcher probably weighs 75 pounds. So you better hope it's somebody's little bitty grandmother that you're carrying, and it's like, why didn't you put them in the stair chairs? So make sure you consider all the possibilities before you kill yourself. Okay, let's see. Why are body mechanics so important when lifting and moving patients? Yeah, I don't want to get hurt. Why is using the appropriate patient carrying device an important consideration? So I don't, yeah, you don't hurt your patient or you overdo it yourself. When would an emergency move be necessary? Yep, life or limb. They're in danger of life or limb immediately. In what ways can proper positioning help a patient's condition? Yeah. Can it make it worse or can it make it better? So sometimes positioning is very important. Okay, you arrive at a vehicle crash and you find an elderly driver slumped over the wheel. Upon examination, you determine the patient is in respiratory arrest. That means they're not breathing. It means they still have a pulse, but they're not breathing. Which move would be most appropriate for this patient? Just about. That's actually right on the cusp there. He really is she is in jeopardy of life or limb because she's not breathing, and within a very short amount of time, she's going to lose her pulse. So in that case, I'd probably go with emergency move. I know why you said urgent. See, that wasn't a bad chapter, was it? What time is it? Y'all take a 10-minute break. Our next chapter is about as long as this one. Not too bad, huh?